After my wife died, everyone told me to fight. The lawyer, my son. I didn't. I was tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. 3 weeks after the funeral, I sat in a glass conference room and let grief make my decisions for me. I signed every page they slid in front of me without reading a single word. I didn't argue. I didn't hesitate. I just kept my pen moving. They watched closely. They smiled when I finished. That was the moment they thought they'd won. Then their lawyer stopped turning pages. His voice faltered. The color drained from his face as he read the last document in silence. The room shifted, heavy and unmistakable, and I realized something important. My silence had been mistaken for surrender. Before I tell you how that mistake unraveled everything they planned, I need to ask you something personal. If you've ever been underestimated during the worst moment of your life, if grief ever made others think you were weak, please stay with me. Subscribe, and if you're willing, share your own story in the comments. Sometimes knowing we're not alone is the only thing that gets us through the quiet. Laura died on a Tuesday morning. A plain morning, quiet, without ceremony. She was folding laundry in the bedroom, the window open just enough to let in the sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. I was in the kitchen rinsing a mug. By the time I heard the thud and reached her, the house had already changed. Something essential had stepped out of it. They told me it was a stroke. Sudden. No warning signs. No pain, they said, as if that detail could soften anything. I nodded because nodding was easier than asking questions I didn't want answered. The weeks after moved strangely. Too fast and too slow at the same time. People brought food I didn't eat. They spoke in gentle voices that felt rehearsed. Cards piled up on the dining table, sympathy written in careful handwriting, all saying different versions of the same thing. She was loved. She would be missed. I was strong. I wasn't strong. I was empty. The house still smelled like her shampoo. Her shoes were by the door, exactly where she'd kicked them off the night before she died. I didn't move anything. I slept on my side of the bed and left hers untouched, the sheets still holding the faint outline of her body. It felt wrong to disturb it, like erasing proof she had been real. 3 days after the funeral, the silence was broken by a knock that wasn't tentative or kind. I opened the door and found Megan and Alyssa standing there, coats still on, expressions set. Laura's daughters. 34 and 30. Smart, accomplished, self-assured in a way that left little room for doubt. They didn't hug me. They didn't ask how I was holding up. They stepped inside as if they already belonged to the space. They didn't sit down. They stood in the living room, scanning it the way people do when they're mentally measuring something. Value. Square footage. Resale potential. Their eyes passed over Laura's photographs, her books, the small things that made the house feel like ours, and I realized with a quiet, sinking certainty that they weren't seeing any of it. They spoke quickly, efficiently, about timelines, about what needed to be handled, about how hard it must be for me, alone in such a big place. The marriage had been short, they reminded me, only 3 years, as if love were something that accrued interest with time, as if it hadn't mattered because it hadn't lasted long enough by their standards. They said they wanted to secure what belonged to their mother. The words landed heavier than they intended, or maybe exactly as intended. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I stood there, hands at my sides, listening as they spoke about Laura in the past tense like she had been an asset, not a person. They mentioned fairness. They mentioned intentions. They mentioned how difficult legal things could become if people weren't cooperative. I understood then that I wasn't being seen as family. I was being seen as a complication, a delay in a process they had already decided the outcome of. When they finally left, the house felt smaller. Not quieter, smaller, as if the walls had shifted inward while I wasn't looking. The next visit came less than a week later. This time they brought folders. They didn't knock long. They didn't ask if it was a good time. They set the folders on the dining table like offerings, neat stacks of paper clipped and flagged, prepared by someone who knew exactly how these things were supposed to go. Their lawyer wasn't with them yet, but his presence was everywhere, in the language, in the structure, in the confidence with which they spoke. They told me what each document was for before I had a chance to ask. Signatures, transfers, authorizations. Words that sounded administrative, harmless until you listened closely. They spoke over me when I tried to slow things down, corrected me when I used the wrong term, explained patiently and publicly how these situations usually resolved, as if I were a student struggling to keep up. At one point, Megan said something about my age, about how overwhelming these things could be for someone in my position. Alyssa nodded along, sympathetic, as if they were doing me a favor by taking control. I felt something tighten in my chest then. Not anger, not yet, something colder. The realization that my grief was being interpreted as weakness, and my silence as consent. When I said I wanted time, they exchanged a look that wasn't subtle enough to hide their frustration. They reminded me of court costs, of delays, of how public disputes had a way of becoming ugly, embarrassing even. They mentioned mental health evaluations casually, like an afterthought, as if the mere suggestion were enough to keep me in line. By the time their lawyer joined us for the formal meeting a few days later, the narrative had already been written. We sat in a conference room with too much glass and not enough warmth. Sunlight bounced off polished surfaces. Coffee sat untouched in front of me. My son was there, tense, jaw clenched, trying to speak up on my behalf. My own lawyer leaned toward me, whispering that I didn't have to agree to anything, that I had rights, that this wasn't how it had to go. I listened, I nodded, and then I didn't fight. When the documents were passed to me, I signed where they indicated. Once, twice, again and again. I didn't read the paragraphs. I didn't ask for clarification. I didn't look at Laura's name printed so neatly at the top of each page. Across the table, I could feel the shift. The relief, the satisfaction. They thought I had folded. They thought grief had hollowed me out enough to make me compliant. What they didn't understand, what no one in that room understood yet, was that I hadn't stopped caring. I had simply stopped performing. The meeting was scheduled for a Friday morning, downtown, in a building that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and money. The kind of place designed to make people feel small the moment they stepped inside. Glass walls, brushed steel, a reception desk that looked more like a barrier than a welcome. I arrived early, not because I was eager, but because I didn't know where else to be. My son arrived 10 minutes later. He looked older than he had a month ago. Grief had settled into his face differently than it had mine. Sharper, more restless. He kept adjusting his jacket, rubbing his palms together like he was bracing for a cold he couldn't escape. My lawyer arrived shortly after. He greeted me quietly, his voice low, respectful. He had called me twice the night before, urging me to reconsider my approach. He said words like leverage and precedent. He said judges don't like coercion, and neither do probate courts. He said grief wasn't a reason to give up ground that couldn't be reclaimed. I listened then, just as I listen now. Across the table, Laura's daughters sat side by side. They looked composed, prepared. Their lawyer sat between them. Immaculate suit, thin smile, fingers resting lightly on a leather folder that had likely been assembled long before Laura died. Introductions were made, though they felt unnecessary. Everyone already knew who was there and why. The lawyer began speaking immediately. He had a practiced way of talking that sounded informative while quietly establishing control. He explained the purpose of the meeting, the documents in front of us, the mutual understanding that had supposedly already been reached. He spoke about timelines as if they were natural laws, about efficiency, about how prolonging matters rarely benefited anyone involved. He used Laura's name often, too often. Each time, it landed wrong, like hearing a stranger say something intimate. He described the house as an asset, the business as a holding, the accounts as instruments. He framed everything as clean, logical, already decided. When my son tried to interject, the lawyer acknowledged him politely and then continued uninterrupted. When my lawyer raised a concern, it was met with a thin reassurance and a reminder that litigation was always an option, but an unpleasant one. They were building a wall of inevitability, brick by brick. Mental evaluations were mentioned again. Not directly, not as a threat, Just as a procedural safeguard, he said. Something courts sometimes required when widowers made unexpected decisions. I noticed then how often the word rational was used. Rational distribution, rational expectations, rational outcomes. The implication was clear. Anything outside their plan would be emotional. And emotional in this context meant unstable. I watched my son's jaw tighten. I felt my lawyer shift beside me, waiting for a signal to step in more forcefully. I gave none. The documents were passed around. Thick stacks, clipped neatly, flagged with colored tabs that told you where to sign. The lawyer explained each one briefly, summarizing entire paragraphs in single sentences designed to sound reasonable. This transfers ownership. This streamlines operations. This prevents future disputes. No one asked me how I was doing. When the pen was placed in front of me, there was a pause. A small one, but noticeable. The kind of silence that waits to see if someone will surprise you. I picked up the pen. My lawyer leaned closer, voice barely audible. He said my name once, quietly. It wasn't forceful. It was disappointed. I signed. Once. Again. And again. Page after page. I didn't read the words, but I recognized the structure. I had signed enough contracts in my life to know the shape of surrender when it was dressed up as cooperation. Across the table, I could see the shift. The daughters relaxed slightly. Their lawyer's smile deepened, just enough to be noticed if you were looking for it. They thought this was over. When I finished the last page, I slid the pen back toward the center of the table and folded my hands in my lap. My movements were slow, deliberate, calm. No one spoke for a moment. Then the lawyer gathered the documents and began reviewing them. A final check before closing the folder and sealing the outcome. That was when the room changed. It was subtle at first. A pause that went on a second too long. His eyes stopped moving. His fingers tightened on the paper. He flipped back a page. Then another. The color drained from his face in a way that had nothing to do with lighting. He stopped smiling. No one else spoke. The air thickened, heavy with something unspoken. I watched as his confidence faltered, replaced by confusion, then something closer to alarm. He cleared his throat once, tried to speak, didn't. Laura's daughters leaned in, whispering questions to him under their breath. He didn't answer right away. My lawyer straightened beside me, sensing the shift before understanding it. Finally, the other lawyer looked up. He didn't look at me first. He looked at my lawyer, then at my son, then back down at the document that had unraveled his certainty. I think, he said slowly, carefully, we need to pause. No one smiled now. I remained silent. For the first time since Laura died, I felt something settle into place. Not satisfaction, not relief, but clarity. They had mistaken my grief for confusion, my quiet for compliance. And in doing so, they had missed what mattered most. The story they thought was finished had only just reached the page they hadn't bothered to read. After that meeting, they stopped pretending I was part of the conversation. The shift was immediate. Not dramatic, not loud, just efficient. Emails began arriving that weren't addressed to me directly. I was copied sometimes, informed, never consulted. They talked about timelines as if I had already agreed to vacate my own life. Listing dates were proposed, then revised, then finalized. Contractors were mentioned. Realtors' names appeared in threads I hadn't started. There were discussions about repainting, about removing dated elements, about improving curb appeal. Someone suggested replacing the front door. Another suggested staging the living room to feel less personal. Less personal. I read those words late one night, sitting at the kitchen table with Laura's mug still by the sink, unwashed because I couldn't bring myself to rinse away the faint coffee ring she'd left behind. I stared at the screen and realized they were already speaking about the house in the past tense, as if I were a temporary tenant who had overstayed his welcome. No one asked when I planned to leave. They told me when it would be best. Alyssa sent a message suggesting I start sorting through things to make the transition easier. Megan followed up with a list of charities that accepted used clothing and books. It was framed as helpful, thoughtful, efficient. They were erasing me politely. I walked through the house that night, slowly, room by room. I ran my hand along the back of the couch where Laura used to sit with her feet tucked under her, reading. I stopped in the hallway where her laughter used to echo when she was on the phone with her sister. In the bedroom, her books were still stacked on the nightstand, the bookmark still holding her place halfway through a novel she'd never finish. This wasn't inheritance anymore. It was reclamation. They wanted the space, the value, the clean slate. And I was standing in the way of that narrative simply by still existing. The personal violations came next. Someone entered the house while I was out. No forced door. No broken lock. Just a quiet intrusion masked as necessity. I noticed it when I returned and found the hallway closet slightly ajar. The angle wrong. Then the bedroom drawer that didn't quite close the way it always had. Laura's jewelry box had been opened. Nothing was missing. That was the point. It wasn't theft. It was inspection. A reminder that they felt entitled to inventory my grief. When I asked Megan about it, she didn't deny it. She said they'd needed to locate specific items belonging to their mother. She said they didn't think I'd mind. She said it was better to do these things sooner rather than later. Sooner than what, I wondered. Than my consent? I stopped sleeping in the bedroom after that. I moved to the guest room, the one Laura's daughters had used during holidays, the room that still felt neutral enough not to ache. The bed creaked differently. The light came in at a different angle. It felt like exile within my own walls. My son was furious when he found out. He called Megan directly, raised his voice in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. He told them they were crossing lines. He told them they couldn't just walk in and take things. They responded calmly. They reminded him of paperwork, of authority, of how complicated these situations could become if emotions took over. They told him I had already agreed to everything. That was when I realized how complete the narrative was in their minds. How thoroughly they believed I had relinquished not just my assets but my agency. They began discussing the business next. The company Laura and I had built together wasn't large, but it was steady. It had paid our bills, funded our quiet plans for the future. It was never meant to be impressive, just sustainable, meaningful. They spoke about it as if it were an inconvenience, something to be liquidated, streamlined, absorbed into something more efficient. They suggested selling my shares quickly to avoid market complications. They framed it as protecting value. They talked about continuity as if Laura hadn't been the continuity, as if her vision could be reduced to numbers on a page. One afternoon, a man I didn't know showed up at the office. He introduced himself as a consultant. He said he'd been asked to take a look at operations. He asked questions that felt invasive, premature. I sent him away. That night, I sat alone in the living room, lights off, rain tapping softly against the windows. The house felt watchful, as if it knew what was happening and was waiting to see whether I would disappear quietly or stand my ground. I didn't feel anger yet. What I felt was something deeper and more unsettling. The realization that grief had made me invisible to people who had already decided I was expendable. Laura's presence felt closer in those moments. Not as a voice, not as a memory, but as a steady pressure. A sense that she was aware of what was unfolding, that she had anticipated it in ways I hadn't. I found myself thinking back to small conversations we'd had, throwaway comments at the time, her insistence on keeping certain documents updated, her quiet questions about what happens if people don't behave the way we hope they will. I hadn't understood then. Now, surrounded by boxes I hadn't packed and plans I hadn't agreed to, I began to suspect that she had known exactly who would come for what, and that she hadn't left me as unprotected as they believed. The next morning, my phone rang, and for the first time since the funeral, the voice on the other end didn't assume I was finished. The phone rang just after 9 that morning. I was standing at the kitchen counter, staring at a stack of unopened mail I no longer trusted. Bills, condolences, legal notices, paper had become something I associated with loss. The number was unfamiliar. I almost let it go to voicemail. Grief teaches you avoidance quickly, but something made me answer. She introduced herself calmly, professionally. Rachel Moore, Laura's attorney. Not the firm lawyer who had handled the early paperwork. Not the polite intermediary who sent templated emails and copied everyone involved. Rachel was different. Her voice carried weight, not urgency. The kind of voice that doesn't rush because it already knows where the conversation is going. She said she had been trying to reach me for days. She said she was aware of what had been happening. She didn't ask if it was true. She told me to attend the next scheduled meeting. And then she told me something that made me sit down. Laura had anticipated this. Not vaguely, not in theory. Specifically, Rachel explained that Laura had come to her 10 days before she died. Not sick, not frightened, just focused. She had requested revisions to her estate plan. Not dramatic changes, but precise ones. Language added. Conditions clarified. Safeguards installed quietly. Like locks on doors no one expects to be tested so soon. Laura had spoken about pressure. About expectations. About how people behave when grief creates an opening. Rachel didn't editorialize. She didn't call anyone names. She simply relayed facts the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis, clear, unembellished, impossible to misunderstand. She told me not to sign anything else. She told me not to confront anyone. She told me to let things continue exactly as they were. Attend the meeting, she said. Sign what they put in front of you, and wait. I asked her why Laura hadn't told me. Rachel paused then, just long enough for the silence to mean something. She said you wouldn't want to believe it, Rachel replied. She said you would try to smooth things over, protect everyone. She didn't want you carrying that weight while she was alive. That landed harder than anything the daughters had done. Laura had known me well enough to prepare for my hesitation, to understand that my instinct would always be to absorb discomfort rather than escalate it. She had planned not around my strength, but around my gentleness. After the call ended, I sat there for a long time. The house felt different. Not warmer, not lighter, but steadier, as if something structural had been reinforced without my noticing. For the first time since the funeral, I didn't feel like I was reacting. I was following a path Laura had already cleared. The next meeting was scheduled downtown again. Same building, same glass-heavy conference room overlooking the river. The setting was meant to project transparency, control, superiority. They arrived confident. Laura's daughters barely looked at me when I entered. Their lawyer greeted me with professional politeness, the kind that assumes cooperation because it has been rewarded so far. My son was tense but quiet. My own lawyer looked confused, caught between his instincts and my instructions to let things proceed. Rachel arrived last. She didn't rush. She didn't apologize. She placed her briefcase on the table, nodded to me once, and took her seat. There was a moment of recalibration then. A subtle one. The other lawyer's eyes flicked toward her, assessing, adjusting. The meeting began the same way it always had. Numbers, percentages, forward-looking language designed to close doors rather than open them. I signed where indicated. Once. Again. I didn't look at Rachel. I didn't hesitate. They smiled. That was when Rachel spoke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. She simply placed a single document on the table, centered it carefully, and slid it forward. A final amendment, executed 10 days before Laura's death. The lawyer across from us reached for it reflexively, then stopped. His hand hovered, uncertain. He glanced at Megan and Alyssa, then back at the document, as if hoping it might explain itself without being read. Rachel waited. When he finally began to read, the room shifted. I watched his posture change, the way his shoulders stiffened, the way his breathing slowed, not with calm, but with calculation. The language was clear, unambiguous. It accounted for coercion, for pressure, for attempts to intimidate or rush decisions during a defined period of mourning. It outlined consequences, specific ones. The room went quiet in a way that felt earned. No one interrupted as the implications settled. No one rushed to object. The confidence that had filled the space drained away, replaced by something brittle. Rachel didn't look at me when she spoke next. She addressed the room. This amendment was drafted precisely to address the situation unfolding here, she said. Any attempt to force transfers, enter the property without consent, or pressure the surviving spouse within the stated period triggers a reallocation clause. The lawyer stopped reading. He didn't need to continue. Everyone understood. Laura hadn't left things unfinished. She had anticipated not just grief, but opportunism. Not just conflict, but strategy. And she had responded with something more enduring than anger. Preparation. I sat there, hands folded, heart steady for the first time in weeks. They had come expecting closure. Instead, they had walked into a structure designed to withstand them. And for the first time since Laura died, I felt her presence not as absence, but as intention. No one spoke for a long moment after Rachel finished. Silence like that isn't empty. It's crowded with calculations, with fear trying to decide what shape to take. I watched it move across the table, settle into their expressions. Megan was the first to recover. Her composure didn't crack, but it tightened. She asked a question that wasn't really a question, something about interpretation, about intent, about whether the amendment truly applied to standard administrative actions. Rachel answered without looking at her notes. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The amendment applied exactly as written. The lawyer tried a different angle. He spoke about ambiguity, about how courts sometimes viewed late-stage changes with skepticism. He said words like challengeable and reviewable, as if saying them aloud might soften their impact. Rachel let him finish. Then she explained, carefully, that the amendment had been executed properly. Witnessed, notarized, logged. That Laura had passed a capacity evaluation as part of the process. That the language had been drafted specifically to withstand challenge. She didn't say this part with pride. She said it with finality. That was when the meeting truly ended. Even though we all remained seated. They asked for time. To review. To consult. To reassess next steps. The confidence that had framed every earlier interaction was gone now, replaced by a brittle politeness that didn't quite hold. We agreed to adjourn. Outside, the air felt different, sharper, cleaner. The river below moved steadily, indifferent to the drama that had just unfolded above it. I stood there for a moment after everyone else had dispersed, watching the water move forward without urgency. Rachel stood beside me, quiet. She didn't want this to be a fight, she said eventually. She wanted it to be corrective. That word stayed with me. Corrective. Not punitive. Not vengeful. Just enough pressure to return things to their proper alignment. The following days were strangely calm. Emails stopped arriving. Calls went unanswered. The consultant who had shown up at the office didn't return. The realtor's name disappeared from my inbox. It was as if a switch had been flipped, turning off a process that had been running on assumption rather than authority. I slept in the bedroom again. I washed Laura's mug, not because I was ready to let go, but because I didn't want her last gesture to be defined by stagnation. She had acted, decisively, thoughtfully. It felt wrong to freeze in place now. Rachel and I met privately a few days later to go over everything in detail. The amendment wasn't dramatic in structure, but it was precise in effect. The house remained mine. The business remained mine. The investments remained mine. Laura's daughters were allocated a fixed amount, clearly outlined. Fair. Generous, even, but conditional. Any attempt to coerce, intimidate, rush, or bypass me during the defined mourning period reduced that amount significantly. They had already triggered the clause. There was no argument to be made. No interpretation to soften it. Their actions were documented. Emails, entry records, witness statements, timelines. Laura had anticipated not just behavior, but proof. When Rachel laid it all out, I felt something close to awe. Not at the law, but at the clarity with which Laura had seen things I had refused to see. I thought back to small moments in our marriage. Her insistence on writing things down. Her quiet habit of confirming details. The way she asked questions that seemed unnecessary at the time. She had been preparing not because she distrusted people, but because she understood them. The daughters reached out once more. Not with demands this time, with careful language, with softened tone. They said there had been misunderstandings, that emotions had been high, that they wanted to move forward amicably. Rachel responded on my behalf. The terms were restated, the consequences unchanged. They accepted, not gracefully, but fully. That was the last communication I received from them directly. With the pressure gone, I was finally able to think about what came next. Not defensively, but deliberately. I didn't want to run the business alone. It had never been just mine. Laura had trusted one manager deeply, a woman who had been with us since the early days. I transferred operations to her, quietly, with gratitude. I stayed involved only where it mattered. I didn't want the house to become a monument to what was lost. I kept it because it was ours, but I allowed it to change slowly. I repainted one room, donated a few things Laura had never been attached to, let light back in where grief had closed the curtains. The money Laura had protected wasn't meant to sit untouched. She had talked often about a program she wished she'd had time to start. Something practical, grounded, meant to help people navigate the kind of transitions she knew too well. I funded it, not in her name, not as a memorial, as a continuation. My son comes by every weekend now. We cook simple meals, sit without filling every silence. He never asks about the estate or the meetings or the outcome. He asks if I'm sleeping, if I'm eating enough, if the house feels too quiet. Sometimes it does. Sometimes, late at night, I sit in the living room and swear I can hear Laura laughing at some old show we used to watch together. It's not painful anymore. It's grounding. She knew who would come for what. She knew who I was too. And she made sure the truth, not the noise, would be the thing that outlived her. The final confrontation didn't look like one. There was no raised voice, no dramatic exit, no moment where anyone stood up and declared victory or defeat. That was the part one found most unsettling afterward, the way everything resolved itself in silence, as if the truth no longer needed witnesses. Rachel requested one last meeting. Not because it was required, but because closure, when done properly, prevents reinvention. Facts don't stay facts unless someone anchors them. We met in the same building. Different room. Smaller. No river view this time. Just a table, for chairs, and the weight of what had already been decided. Megan and Alyssa arrived together. Their posture had changed. Less upright. Less certain. They were dressed professionally, but without the sharpness they'd worn before. Their lawyer followed a few steps behind, no longer projecting confidence, just obligation. I arrived with Rachel. My son wasn't there. I didn't need him to be. The lawyer opened the meeting by acknowledging the amendment. No qualifiers. No caveats. He said the words plainly, the way people do when there is no advantage left in framing things creatively. He confirmed the revised allocations. He confirmed the reduction clause had been triggered. He confirmed there would be no contest. When he finished, no one spoke. I looked at Megan first, then Alyssa. I tried to remember them as Laura's daughters, not as adversaries. Tried to recall holidays, small kindnesses, moments when they had laughed with her, leaned into her, trusted her. I wondered if they understood what they had lost, not materially, but relationally. Rachel broke the silence. She read the final document aloud. The house stayed with me. The business stayed with me. The investments stayed with me. The daughters were left a fixed amount. Still substantial, still life-altering for most people, but only because Laura had wanted it that way. Not because they had earned it through their actions. The condition was read next. Any attempt to coerce, contest, intimidate, or pressure me within the defined period would result in forfeiture of a portion of that amount. Rachel didn't emphasize it. She didn't have to. Their lawyer stopped her halfway through. He said there was no need to continue. That was the moment I understood how thoroughly the power had shifted. Not because I had taken anything from them, but because Laura had removed the illusion that they were entitled to it. Megan stared at the table. Alyssa's hands were clenched in her lap. Neither of them looked at me. I didn't speak. There was nothing to explain. When the meeting ended, they left without saying goodbye. Rachel and I remained seated for a few moments longer. She gathered her papers slowly, methodically, The way people do when they are certain they won't be returning to a place. That's it, she said. Legally and practically. I nodded. Outside, the city moved on. Traffic. Footsteps. The quiet indifference of a world that doesn't pause for private reckonings. I walked alone for a while after that. No destination. Just movement. I passed storefronts, cafes, people laughing into phones, people arguing quietly, people living inside moments that had nothing to do with mine. I felt lighter than I expected. Not triumphant. Not relieved in the way movies portray it. Just unburdened. The following weeks confirmed what the meeting had already sealed. The daughters collected their allocation through their attorney. No messages. No personal notes. No attempt to renegotiate. The money moved cleanly, efficiently, as money often does when it's finally stripped of emotion. They disappeared from my life after that. I didn't block them. I didn't need to. Absence can be a kind of boundary. The house settled back into itself. The tension I hadn't realized I was carrying eased. I stopped listening for footsteps that weren't there. I stopped bracing for emails that never came. Laura's presence felt different now. Less urgent. Less protective. As if she had completed something important and trusted me to live inside the result. One evening, I stood in the doorway of the bedroom and noticed something I hadn't before. A faint mark on the wall where a picture frame had hung for years, catching the light just right. I left it there. Not everything needs to be repaired. The justice Laura had engineered wasn't loud or public. No one outside that small circle would ever know what had almost happened, or how close I'd come to being erased quietly, politely, with my own signature. But I knew, and more importantly, she knew. Life didn't snap back into place after that. It didn't need to. It adjusted slowly the way a body does after a long illness. Tentative at first, testing what still works, what hurts, what has changed permanently. The house grew quieter, but not in a way that frightened me anymore. The silence stopped feeling like abandonment and started feeling like space. Space to think. Space to remember without being interrupted by intrusion or expectation. I kept the house because it was ours. Not because it was valuable, not because it was large, not because winning mattered. I kept it because Laura and I had chosen it together. Because the kitchen counter still held the faint groove from where she'd dropped a knife years ago and laughed it off. Because the window in the bedroom caught the morning light exactly the way she liked. Because some places absorb the people who live in them, and walking away would have felt like leaving her behind a second time. But I didn't preserve it like a shrine. That would have been another kind of erasure. I let it breathe. I donated what didn't matter. I kept what did. I moved furniture, opened windows, painted one wall a lighter color because the room needed it, not because anyone else told me it would sell better that way. I learned, slowly, that honoring someone doesn't mean freezing them in time. It means letting what they built continue to change. The business transitioned cleanly. The manager Laura trusted took over day-to-day operations, just as she would have wanted. I stayed involved only where I added value. I stopped measuring my worth by output and started measuring it by alignment. Was this still serving the purpose Laura and I had defined, or was it just habit? The program I funded grew quietly. No announcements, no plaques, just steady work. People who needed guidance found it. People who needed support received it without having to beg or perform. That felt right. Laura had always believed that help should arrive without spectacle. Her daughters didn't reach out again. I thought at first that I would feel something sharper about that. Anger, regret, vindication. But what I felt instead was clarity. They had chosen their approach. Laura had chosen her response. I had chosen to honor it. Not every story ends in reconciliation. Some end in recognition. My son became a constant. He showed up every Saturday without fail. Sometimes we worked on the house together. Sometimes we cooked. Sometimes we sat in silence, the television on low, neither of us really watching. He never asked about the legal details. He never asked what his stepsisters had lost or gained. He asked if I was sleeping, if I was eating enough, if the nights were still hard. I told him the truth. Some nights were. Some weren't. Grief doesn't disappear. It changes temperature. At first it burns. Then it aches. Eventually, it settles into something that warms and wounds at the same time. You learn to live with that contradiction. Late at night, when the house is dark and the world feels far away, I sometimes sit in the living room and let old memories surface without trying to control them. Laura laughing at a line in a show we'd seen a dozen times. Laura standing in the doorway, arms crossed, pretending to be stern before breaking into a smile. Laura planning ahead quietly, carefully, loving fiercely without needing recognition. She had known who would come for what. She had known who I was too. She understood that I would endure more than I should if it meant keeping the peace. That I would mistake restraint for responsibility. That I would sign papers rather than argue when my heart was too heavy to lift my voice. So she did what I couldn't. She protected the life we built. Not with confrontation, not with bitterness, but with foresight. I think about that often now. About how strength doesn't always look like resistance. Sometimes it looks like preparation. Sometimes it looks like trusting someone to reveal themselves fully before you respond. I didn't fight after Laura died. I didn't need to. She had already fought in the only way that mattered. Quietly, thoughtfully, with love that extended beyond her own life. And now, when I lock the door at night and turn off the lights, I don't feel like I'm guarding something fragile. I feel like I'm living inside something that held, something that lasted, something that told the truth long after she was gone.